The discovery came unexpectedly, hidden inside a rust-flaked ammunition crate buried beneath a collapsed farmhouse near the old Arden line. Inside it lay a collection of field notes, after-action sketches, and a single torn page from an American officer's diary. The writing, smudged by moisture and time, described an event so shocking that even veterans of the Eastern Front had struggled to explain it. What these fragments revealed was not merely another story of hardship in the winter of 1944, but the unveiling of a weapon so advanced that it overturned every rule soldiers believed governed survival. This account, reconstructed from those remnants, exposes how a single battlefield decision reshaped the course of the war. As you follow this narrative, consider subscribing so you never miss the next recovered wartime revelation. The morning of December 16, 1944 began like countless others on the frozen ridges near Montreal. Yet eyewitness fragments recovered from the site describe a disturbance that defied every expectation of the soldiers advancing through the dense frostbitten woods. German formations moving steadily toward American cavalry outposts, braced for the familiar sequence of ground shaking, impacts that usually followed the whistle of incoming artillery. Instead, something impossible unfolded. Shells began exploding high above them, tearing open the sky with calibrated precision. The air filled with whirling metal fragments that struck downward in lethal cones, reaching foxholes, trenches, and improvised shelters alike. Veterans who had survived years of Soviet bombardment realized instantly that this was not the artillery they understood. This was a weapon behaving as though it could see them. From the documents left behind, it became clear that the decision triggering this transformation had been made not in a command post, but in the mind of a single American officer. Through the smoke and confusion, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group had assessed the dire conditions facing the 38th Cavalry Squadron. Their positions were collapsing under numerical inferiority, with little room to maneuver. Standard munitions were insufficient. German infantry advanced in thick formations, confident that established tactics and terrain knowledge would shield them. Axelson, recognizing imminent disaster, issued an order that defied protocol. He authorized the use of a classified shell type protected by extreme secrecy: proximity-fused artillery rounds. These fuses, built upon miniaturized radar assemblies, detonated not upon contact or timer settings but by sensing their proximity to the ground or any reflective surface. Their internal systems, no larger than fragments of a portable radio, triggered explosive bursts at predetermined heights that maximized fragmentation range. Though the devices had been used primarily against aircraft, their potential against ground troops had been theorized only in controlled tests. For Axelson to deploy them on his own authority was a gamble that risked court-martial, yet he chose immediate tactical necessity over obedience. Witness statements indicate that the resulting devastation surpassed anything recorded in prior engagements. Shells bursting in midair disrupted every entrenched instinct German infantry had relied upon. Soldiers accustomed to flattening themselves in trenches found no safety from above. Trees, once reliable cover, splintered into thousands of high-velocity shards that multiplied the damage. The psychological effect was equally catastrophic. Survivors described looking upward rather than downward, unsure from which direction death would descend. Within minutes, entire assault groups dissolved under the raining fragments. This initial encounter marked the beginning of a wider transformation of the Ardennes battlefield. What began as an unauthorized act would soon be recognized by higher command as a turning point. As you continue through this series, consider subscribing so future historical reconstructions reach you as soon as they are unearthed. They struggled to understand what had struck them spread rapidly through German ranks. Units that had trained extensively for the winter offensive, believing they held both strategic surprise and numerical advantage, suddenly confronted an invisible threat. Reports from platoon leaders described formations disintegrating before they could establish firing lines. Men who had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Damansk pocket insisted they had never witnessed artillery capable of bypassing natural cover so thoroughly. The airbursts arrived in patterns to be chance, detonating at heights that maximized shrapnel radius. It seemed as if the shells themselves calculated the ideal moment to kill, unbeknownst to those on the receiving end. The scientific achievement behind these fuses had required one of the most ambitious American research efforts of the war. Laboratories disguised as mundane businesses had been redirected toward a singular purpose: to solve the problem of creating electronics durable enough to endure the force of artillery launch. Each shell's internal components had to survive acceleration forces that exceeded anything experienced by aviation equipment. Specialized vacuum tubes, shrunk to the size of pencil erasers, had been engineered to endure temperatures, vibrations, and rotational stresses far beyond civilian applications. Engineers worked with the secrecy and urgency normally reserved for atomic research, aware that even the capture of a single intact fuse could compromise the program. Production notes recovered after the war revealed that factories across the United States produced tens of thousands of fuses daily, each one meticulously inspected and tested. Workers were given minimal information about their purpose. Some believed they were building components for aircraft radios or shipborne sensors. Only a select few understood that these devices would grant artillery shells the unprecedented capacity to sense their surroundings. The industrial discipline necessary to produce such components at scale rivaled the most demanding projects of the conflict. As the Battle of the Bulge expanded, higher headquarters soon learned of Axel Sund's unauthorized deployment. Instead of reprimanding him, they recognized the dire need for any advantage capable of halting the German advance. Communications from Supreme Headquarters revealed that within days, proximity-fused ordnance was approved for widespread ground use. Artillery units across the Ardennes received shipments. Even as fighting intensified, their use no longer depended on clear sight lines, adjusted trajectories, or elaborate timing procedures. The shells simply needed to be fired in the direction of enemy formations. Their internal sensors would determine the rest. Artillery battalions, defending key towns and road networks, quickly learned how drastically this changed their battlefield influence. American units surrounded in critical junctions witnessed the difference firsthand. Their limited ammunition could now yield casualties once achievable only through overwhelming barrages. German attempts to exploit poor weather, night conditions, or fog no longer granted protection. Airbursts materialized without the need for forward observers. Shells could detonate above supply convoys, assault lines, even resting troops. The tactical sanctuary that winter storms once provided was effectively erased. This shift ended any expectation of steady, methodical assault progression. Panic spread through German positions as officers realized that traditional spacing, camouflage, and dispersion offered little advantage. The battlefield had evolved into a domain where the sky itself could suddenly erupt into shredding metal. What unfolded over the next weeks reshaped the fate of the entire offensive. As the German command attempted to comprehend the unfolding chaos, field reports grew increasingly contradictory and desperate. Units that had counted on forest cover as a natural shield during the offensive rapidly discovered that the canopy above them had become an unforeseen liability. Proximity-detonated shells, bursting at heights meticulously optimized by their internal sensors, transformed the woods into a storm of lethal debris. Not only did the explosions release thousands of metal shards, but the force shattered branches and bark, turning them into deadly splinters that traveled with near-ballistic velocity. Men who had trained for years in forest tactics, confident in their ability to navigate and survive woodland combat, found their expertise useless against the downward sweep of airburst artillery. Recovered personnel logs describe entire platoons disappearing before they could deploy into defensive patterns. The old methods hugging the ground, sheltering beneath thick roots, finding cover behind trees failed in the face of a weapon designed to defeat such instincts. Survivors reported that the sensation of being targeted from above eroded discipline in ways ground fire never had. When shells burst at ground level, soldiers at least knew where not to step. But with airbursts, there was no directional logic. The threat came from all points simultaneously, creating a suffocating sense of exposure. German medics wrote that they treated injuries unlike any seen earlier in the war. Wounds from both metal fragments and high-speed wooden splinters that penetrated helmets, greatcoats, and equipment. As American artillery units grasped the devastating potential of these they began refining their employment with remarkable speed. Artillery commanders realized they no longer needed pinpoint precision. With proximity fuses, an area-targeted barrage could produce results similar to direct hits. This allowed them to conserve ammunition while increasing overall lethality. The tactical flexibility granted by this new technology became especially significant in the Ardennes, where terrain and weather often hampered visibility and communication. Forward observers, normally essential for correcting fire, frequently found themselves unable to see more than 100 feet ahead. Yet proximity-fused shells required no correction. They performed the calculations themselves at fortified crossroads, towns, and defensive ridges. American units under siege found renewed strength. Instead of waiting for reinforcements or clear skies, they could hammer advancing forces with immediate effect. In several instances documented after the battle, German assaults dissolved so quickly under these airbursts that defenders struggled to assess whether further waves were approaching. Infantry companies defending strategic road junctions positions, whose loss could have ruptured the American line, held out far longer than expected because proximity-fused fire shattered German concentration before assaults could fully form. German High Command, desperate for answers, ordered technical officers to examine any fragments of the strange fuses that could be recovered. But the chaos of battle and the tremendous stresses placed on the devices made intact. Examples rare. Captured pieces often appeared so distorted that engineers dismissed the presence of vacuum tubes as Allied deception. They believed it impossible for such delicate components to survive artillery launch. Some argued the shells must employ magnetic fields or atmospheric sensors instead, misdirecting their analysis at the moment when accurate understanding was most critical. Meanwhile, American units continued refining their tactics. They discovered that the combination of snow-covered ground and airburst shells created a secondary effect. Shards of ice and compacted snow became additional projectiles. This phenomenon, rarely documented but repeatedly observed by soldiers, amplified damage and confusion among advancing German formations. Troops, expecting to use white camouflage in winter terrain to their advantage, instead found themselves exposed to an invisible, omnidirectional barrage. As this deadly adaptation continued, entire German regiments concluded that advancing in tight formations was suicidal. They attempted to spread out, but this only slowed the offensive and left isolated groups vulnerable to attempts to move under the cover of night or fog backfired, as proximity fuses performed equally well in darkness. In the words of a recovered diary fragment from a German NCO, "We feared the sky more than the enemy rifles. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, nowhere to think." This was the beginning of a profound shift in the psychological landscape of the battlefield. Soldiers faced not just the physical devastation, but the realization that the familiar principles of combat no longer applied. And as American artillery adapted further, the weight of that realization deepened. If this story compels you, consider subscribing so that future historical reconstructions continue to reach you. As the offensive intensified, the arrival of proximity-fused shells across multiple American artillery battalions fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Ardennes. Battalions defending surrounded strongpoints soon understood that they held an unprecedented force multiplier, while German units relied on speed and the element of surprise, particularly during the early breakthroughs. The growing use of proximity fuses slowed their advance dramatically. Every attempt to mass troops, whether for assault, resupply, or reinforcement, became a potential death sentence. One of the most thoroughly documented examples occurred near the Sauer River, where German units attempted a nocturnal crossing under the assumption that darkness and fog would conceal their movements. Traditional artillery would have required adjustments and spotting time-consuming tasks under those conditions, but proximity-fused munitions needed neither. As the crossing began, American batteries unleashed a barrage that detonated precisely above the clustered soldiers. The riverbank offered no shelter. The partially frozen water behind them prevented retreat, and the downward sweep of fragments cut through the tightly packed battalion in minutes. Historical records corroborate that this single engagement produced casualties on a scale rarely achieved by artillery alone. Meanwhile, defenders in towns such as Bastogne discovered that proximity fuses provided a lifeline against repeated assaults. With limited ammunition, they could not afford wasteful fire. Yet proximity-fused shells allowed them to inflict disproportionate damage with far fewer rounds. German troops, attempting to cross open fields or approach through wooded areas, found themselves annihilated before coming within rifle range. The blasts tore through snow and timber, creating shockwaves that echoed across the frozen landscape. After-action reports indicate that German officers described these areas as zones where even silence felt dangerous. Elite units were not spared from the sweeping effects of this new technology. Special operations groups, including highly trained commandos, attempted to exploit disguises, infiltration tactics, and confusion within American lines. But proximity fuses cared nothing for strategy or training. When these troops attempted to mass for assaults or reposition under cover, The airbursts struck with the same mechanical indifference. Their discipline, which had been their strength in previous operations, offered no protection against shells that seemed to detect their very presence. The longer the battle continued, the more dramatic the operational implications became. German generals who initially believed the offensive could divide Allied forces and regain strategic initiative now faced delays, attrition, and collapsing morale. Their supply lines, strained from the outset, suffered continuous bombardment. Convoys hidden beneath tree cover were exposed by the very branches meant to conceal them. Fuel shortages worsened as tank columns halted to avoid artillery-inflicted losses. Engineers struggled to clear roads when bursts shredded their teams before work could be completed. American commanders, exploiting the newfound lethality of their artillery, employed innovative techniques such as synchronized barrages, in which multiple battalions fired so that shells arrived simultaneously. This tactic turned proximity fuses into an instrument of overwhelming devastation, creating overlapping airbursts that left attacking units with no avenue of escape. The psychological shock of these perfectly timed bombardments reverberated through captured reports. Prisoners admitted that after experiencing such fire, many soldiers refused to assemble in groups, fearing that any hint of clustering would trigger another catastrophic barrage. All the while, American production lines continued feeding the front with astonishing speed. Factories working around the clock produced enough proximity fuses to distribute across the entire region. Even small artillery detachments began receiving limited numbers of these advanced rounds. Each delivery reshaped local engagements, tipping skirmishes, delaying offensives, and wearing down German forces already struggling in the brutal winter. As this technology spread across the battlefield, the German High Command finally acknowledged the impossibility of restoring momentum. Their offensive timetable fractured, and instead of pressing forward with coherent attacks, they found themselves reacting constantly to unexpected losses. Plans that depended on massed force became untenable. Units meant to support breakthroughs were annihilated before they could reach their positions. By late December, senior German officers recognized that they were fighting not just enemy troops, but an entirely new form of Warfare 1, in which a shell no longer needed direct observation or precise timing to kill. The battlefield had evolved, and they were facing a weapon that represented the future, not merely an improvement of the past. As the final weeks of December unfolded, the transformative impact of proximity-fused artillery became impossible for either side to ignore. American divisions, previously stretched thin across the Ardennes front, now observed dramatic shifts in German behavior. Units that once advanced confidently through the woods began moving hesitantly, stopping frequently, scanning the tree canopy as if expecting the sky itself to rupture. Reports from American patrols indicated that German soldiers were increasingly reluctant to gather even in small groups, their discipline eroded by the omnipresent threat of airburst fire. What had begun as a technological advantage was rapidly becoming a psychological stranglehold. At the operational level, American commanders took full advantage of this new dynamic. Major General William Keane, among others, emphasized flexible, dynamic artillery coordination. His staff developed fire schedules that exploited German reluctance to assemble. Instead of waiting for confirmed concentrations, they targeted likely staging Ares Road junctions, forest clearings, frozen creek crossings, and the edges of captured villages. Even when the Germans attempted to disperse, these predicted-fired tactics proved devastating. Proximity fuses effectively punished any attempt at organization, no matter how cautious. One of the defining engagements illustrating this shift occurred near the village of Champs, west of German Panzergrenadiers, ordered to regroup for a coordinated assault, attempted to gather in a shallow depression that offered natural cover from ground-level fire. Under normal circumstances, such a position would have been ideal for assembling troops, but American observers, alerted by scattered movement, called for a barrage of proximity-fused shells. What followed was described by survivors as a sudden downward explosion that obliterated the staging area. The depression became a trap, its sloping sides channeling fragments directly onto the massed troops. When American patrols later inspected the site, they found that the proximity fuses had detonated almost perfectly over the center of the formation, causing destruction that ground-burst shells could never have achieved. As similar reports accumulated, German leadership found itself confronting an uncomfortable truth. Their doctrine, heavily reliant on concentrated shock action, was incompatible with the new battlefield reality. Blitzkrieg principles, speed, focus, coordinated throughs depended on the ability to mass armor and infantry at decisive points. But 2 mass troops meant presenting a target, and to present a target meant annihilation. The very concept that had revitalized German fortunes in the early war was being dismantled by a single breakthrough in Allied munitions. This forced rapid improvisation. Commanders ordered units to divide into smaller task forces, but splitting their strength only delayed their timetable and weakened their offensive thrusts. In addition, communication between these fragmented groups became increasingly difficult. Radio shortages, harsh weather, and Allied jamming already limited coordination. Dispersal only worsened the problem. What resulted was a patchwork of isolated units stumbling through snowbound forests, unaware of their neighbors, vulnerable to ambush, and unable to mount unified attacks. Meanwhile, American units that had been on the brink of collapse earlier in the battle discovered that they could now withstand numerically superior forces. Infantry regiments that feared encirclement found renewed confidence. Engineers clearing roads, medics treating the wounded, and supply drivers hauling ammunition all benefited from the newfound breathing room proximity Fuzes provided. Even when German armor attempted to break through, the inability of accompanying infantry to mass made their assaults disjointed and easier to repel. In several after-action reports, American officers noted that proximity-fused barrages frequently disrupted German attacks before they even began. Preparatory movements troops moving into position, officers conducting final briefings, mortared teams assembling equipment were prime targets. The Fuzes effectively extended the reach of American eyes and ears. Even when the defenders could not see their enemy, their artillery could still strike with lethal timing. But beyond the tactical and operational levels, the psychological dimension reached unprecedented levels. Letters recovered from fallen German soldiers reveal growing despair. Some wrote that they felt hunted by an enemy they could not see. Others described the airbursts as metal rain or the invisible scythe. A particularly haunting letter from a young conscript spoke of how the explosion seemed to sense his every movement, concluding with the words, "It feels as though the sky has turned against us." Too many historians, this erosion of morale, combined with the disintegration of tactical cohesion, signaled the turning point of the Ardennes campaign. Even before the weather cleared and Allied air power returned in force, the offensive had already begun unraveling from below, its foundations weakened, not by tanks or infantry, but by a new kind of artillery whose brilliance lay in its simplicity, exploding not on the ground, but in the air. By the time New Year's approached, the overall structure of the German offensive had deteriorated to a state that many frontline officers understood as irrecoverable, even if high command refused to admit it. The brutal winter conditions, supply shortages, and relent American resistance all played roles. Proximity-fused artillery had become the quiet architect of the German collapse. It did not merely inflict casualties, it denied the Wehrmacht the ability to execute coordinated warfare. It turned forests into death traps, crossroads into killing zones, and open ground into abandoned terrain. And with each passing day, American mastery of the system grew sharper, more deliberate, and more devastating. One of the decisive episodes highlighting this shift occurred near the town of Mon. German units had captured the high ground only hours earlier, positioning themselves for a potential breakthrough toward the Meuse. Their commanders believed they finally held an advantage, visibility, and the element of surprise. But American artillery officers, already accustomed to calculating fire solutions across steep terrain, adjusted their angles for maximum effect. When the first wave of proximity-fused shells reached altitude, they detonated so precisely over the German positions that some observers initially thought the explosions must have been triggered by direct air support. Entire companies were torn apart before they could fortify their lines. Panic spread as surviving groups fled downhill, exposing themselves to machine gun fire and further barrages. This pattern repeated across multiple sectors. Every attempt to establish a foothold, to reorganize, to consolidate gains, was smothered by relentless overhead bursts. Even hardened veterans struggled to adapt. A Panzer Grenadier sergeant, captured after a failed assault near Lutebois, confessed that his men had begun refusing to gather for briefings. "We could not meet, we could not plan, we could not even pray together," he said. Whenever more than 5 of us stood close, the shells came. American commanders recognized they were witnessing a rare moment in military history. A technological leap so significant that it rewrote the logic of the battlefield. This realization spurred them to refine their methods even further. Fire missions became faster. Shells were allocated with increasing precision. Units were reorganized to maximize proximity fuse availability. Some divisions even designated special artillery response groups whose sole task was to disrupt German concentrations. These teams grew exceptionally skilled at detecting patterns in German behavior, predicting assembly points hours before enemy officers arrived. As coordination improved, the effects cascaded upward into operational planning. Generals who had once worried about thin defensive lines now began discussing counteroffensives. Fuel depots that had been held in reserve could be dispatched forward. Medical teams, now reported fewer catastrophic casualties among American troops, because the enemy no longer reached American lines in sufficient strength to inflict them. The balance of attrition had shifted decisively. German commanders, for their part, grew increasingly frantic. Orders became contradictory. Some demanded immediate regrouping for powerful counterblows. Others insisted units stay scattered to avoid artillery. The result was chaos. Troops wandered through snowstorms in fragmented groups, losing track of time, direction, and purpose. Armored columns waited for infantry that would never arrive. Mortars teams set up positions without knowing whether they still supported a larger attack. Compounding these issues, proximity-fused barrages frequently destroyed German communications equipment. Telephone cables were shredded, radio operators killed, signal units scattered. Deprived of information, frontline commanders made decisions based on outdated assumptions. More than 11 German forces launched assaults into areas already under American control, unaware of troop movements that had occurred hours earlier. The cumulative effect was a slow but irreversible collapse. By mid-January, the German offensive had not merely stalled, it had imploded. Not through grand maneuvers or sweeping armored charges, but through thousands of precisely timed detonations that chipped away at organization, morale, and willpower. Every shattered tree, every snow-filled crater, every abandoned rifle told the same story. A modern army reduced to early war disarray by a scientific innovation that functioned almost invisibly, hidden inside the metal shell of a single artillery round. In retrospect, historians often emphasize the return of Allied air superiority as the definitive turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. But for the men on the ground, the infantry, the artillery crews, the medics, the engineers, it was the proximity fuse that bought them time, space, and survival. Its introduction did not merely help win a battle. It reshaped the very trajectory of the war. As January advanced and the German offensive crumbled, the American High Command seized the moment to regain the initiative completely. What began as a desperate defense in the early days of the Ardennes had transformed into an increasingly confident counteroffensive, bolstered not only by fresh reinforcements and improving weather, but by a profound understanding of the battlefield's new shape, fundamentally redrawn by proximity-fused artillery. American divisions that had once fought simply to survive were suddenly able to maneuver, pressure, and reclaim lost ground at a pace unthinkable only weeks earlier. Nowhere was this shift clearer than along the Bastogne corridor. The iconic defense of the encircled town had already become a symbol of stubborn American resistance. But as more artillery equipped with proximity fuses arrived, the region's tactical dynamic changed dramatically. Luftwaffe attacks dwindled as fuel shortages and Allied aircraft increasingly contested the skies. But the real turning point came when American artillery units coordinated counter-battery fire using their new German guns attempting to suppress the defenders found themselves targeted with precision bursts that detonated above their positions, shredding crews and splintering their makeshift winter camouflage. In the forests east of the town, entire batteries were silenced within hours. With artillery dominance secured, American armor began probing outward, reopening the narrow corridors that the German advance had squeezed shut. Engineers pushed through wreckage-strewn roads, clearing felled trees and frozen debris under the cover of friendly fire. Each mile regained provided space for supply convoys to enter, bringing ammunition, medical equipment, warm clothing, and badly needed fuel. And with every convoy, morale surged. The men defending the Ardennes felt the tide turning beneath their feet. German units, disoriented and exhausted, attempted to form rearguard positions to slow the Allied advance. But these defensive lines lacked cohesion. Orders from higher command already, plagued by communication failures or fan, arrived too late or contradicted earlier instructions. Some regiments were told to hold their ground at all costs. Others were instructed to retreat to reorganize for counterattacks that never materialized. Into this confusion came the unrelenting hammer of proximity-fused barrages. As American infantry advanced through snow-laden woods, their greatest threat was not German ambushes, but the terrain itself. The Germans had left behind minefields, booby traps, and frozen corpses that concealed hidden charges beneath the drifts. Yet whenever enemy units attempted to regroup for resistance, artillery observers called down airburst fire with chilling efficiency. Overhead detonations neutralized positions before the advancing troops even came into visual range. The psychological effect on both sides was undeniable. American soldiers pushed forward with the confidence of men backed by an invisible guardian, while German troops fell back in dread of a force they could neither anticipate nor escape. In the northern sector, the collapse became unmistakable. Elite units, including remnants of the SS Panzer divisions, attempted to anchor defensive lines along ridges and frozen streams. Their tanks, though still formidable, found themselves increasingly vulnerable without infantry support. Rapid American fire missions prevented German foot soldiers from assembling around their armor, leaving panzers isolated and susceptible to bazookas, mines, and tank destroyers. Even when the tanks themselves survived, their ability to influence the battle faded. An armored spearhead without infantry was little more than a metal monument, impressive but immobile against coordinated Allied resistance. By mid-January, American generals authorized broader counterattacks, designed not simply to push the Germans out of the Ardennes, but to shatter their operational capabilities entirely. Towns that had changed hands repeatedly, Ophelis, La Roche, Isseton, Ubert, now fell steadily back under Allied control. The rolling thunder of artillery preceded every advance, with proximity-fused shells ensuring that German rearguards were unable to mount cohesive delaying actions. Eyewitness accounts from American officers described scenes that resembled the aftermath of natural disasters. Forests splintered into jagged fragments, snow churned red and black by explosions, roads lined with burned-out half-tracks and abandoned guns. Yet what struck many soldiers most was the silence and near-total absence of organized enemy resistance. The German army, once infamous for discipline, now withdrew in ragged waves, harried not just by Allied forces but by its own fatigue, cold, hunger, and despair. By the end of the month, the offensive that Hitler had once touted as a final reversal of fortune had collapsed entirely. The bulge in the Allied line, once a threatening protrusion, was erased. More importantly, the German army had expended precious reserves of fuel, equipment, and manpower it could never replace, and behind the visible destruction lay a quieter, more decisive victory. The demonstration that proximity-fused artillery had become not merely a new weapon, but a strategic force multiplier capable of altering the entire character of modern warfare. With the German offensive extinguished and the Allies pushing eastward, military analysts at the time began to recognize that the Ardennes had been more than just another battle. It had been a technological revelation. In the months that followed, historians, scientists, and officers alike dissected the implications of the American proximity fuse, acknowledging it as one of the most consequential advancements of the war. While the atom bomb would later overshadow all other technological achievements, those who fought on the frozen front lines knew that, weeks before Hiroshima, the war had already been reshaped by a handful of radio tubes sealed inside hardened steel. The first strategic consequence became clear almost immediately. The proximity fuse dramatically accelerated the erosion of German defensive capabilities across the entire Western Front. As the Allies resumed their broad advance into Germany, they encountered defenders who were increasingly unable to mass for counterattacks or reorganize after breakthroughs. Traditional strongholds, such as river crossings and urban choke points, lost much of their resilience as proximity-fused artillery turned defensive staging areas into lethal traps. German officers who had previously relied on the textbook method of halting and advance assembling infantry behind armored nodes, preparing reserves in forested areas, or launching counterthrusts into overextended spearheads, found themselves the risk of assembling troops in any numbers had become prohibitive. American divisions quickly integrated proximity fuse doctrine into their operational planning. Artillery battalions were restructured to ensure that each regiment had immediate access to these advanced munitions. Fire discipline improved, and the synergy between infantry, armor, and artillery tightened. The effect was cumulative. Where German lines had once stiffened under pressure, they now buckled with alarming speed. Even fortified positions that had weathered months of earlier fighting collapsed within hours under well-coordinated airburst barrages. A second consequence emerged in the broader strategic calculus. The proximity fuse forced German commanders to abandon offensive planning almost entirely. The Ardennes had been their last major attempt to regain initiative in the West, and its failure, magnified by the devastating effectiveness of American artillery, destroyed any hope of future large-scale maneuvers. From early 1945 onward, the Wehrmacht fought in retreat, rarely able to mount counterattacks of more than local significance. The shift from maneuver warfare to desperate static defense accelerated Germany's collapse and ensured that Allied mechanized spearheads could advance with increasing speed. But perhaps the most profound effect of the proximity fuse was psychological. Both within the German ranks and among the Allies, letters, interviews, and diaries from American soldiers reveal a growing confidence in their artillery support. Units that had previously dreaded night attacks or forest ambushes now trusted that their gunners could neutralize threats, even when visibility was poor. Infantry advancing into unknown terrain did so with the knowledge that if they encountered resistance, airburst shells could dismantle enemy positions before they themselves came under heavy fire. On the German side, fear of the unseen dominated the final months of the war. Reports describe soldiers firing nervously into treetops, abandoning positions at the sound of distant artillery, or refusing orders to regroup in forest clearings. Officers struggled to maintain discipline among troops who had come to believe that the Americans possessed a form of weapon detection beyond human perception. Rumors circulated wildly. Some claimed the shells were guided by radar installations in the sky. Others believed airborne observers hovered invisibly above the battlefield. A few even speculated that the Americans had developed a way to detect human movement itself. None understood that the secret lay in a tiny, ruggedized vacuum tube that sensed reflected radio waves. The strategic leadership of the Allies, recognizing the transformative power of this technology, took meticulous steps to protect it. Even after the Ardennes, strict orders required that unexploded proximity-fused shells be recovered or destroyed to prevent German analysis. This precaution proved prudent. Captured documents indicate that German engineers remained baffled by the fragments they studied, unable to comprehend how such delicate electronics could survive the shock of artillery launch. Their inability to reproduce or counter the weapon ensured that the Allies held a decisive advantage right up to the war's end. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed deep into Germany, the proximity fuse had become a symbol of the technological ingenuity that defined late-war American military strategy. Alongside radar, the code-breaking efforts at and the burgeoning atomic program, it illustrated the growing dominance of scientific innovation in determining battlefield outcomes. In retrospect, many analysts believe that if the fuse had been deployed only months earlier, several costly campaigns, such as the Normandy breakout or the battles in the Hurtgen Forest, might have unfolded with dramatically fewer casualties. Manuel. The scientific community began to recognize the proximity fuse as a triumph of interdisciplinary collaboration. Physicists, engineers, chemists, and military tacticians had come together under tight deadlines, overcoming enormous technical obstacles to produce a device that not only functioned but exceeded expectations in every environment. The legacy of that collaboration extended beyond the war. In the decades that followed, the principles behind the proximity fuse influenced radar altimetry, missile guidance systems, and even early spaceflight sensors. By the beginning of spring 1945, the German army was no longer capable of resisting meaningfully. Its once feared formations had been reduced to scattered clusters of exhausted soldiers, forced to retreat faster than their commanders could issue orders. And while many factors contributed to that collapse or sore shortages, Allied air supremacy, an overwhelming industrial imbalance, the proximity fuse stood out as a decisive accelerant, a technological blade that sliced through the Wehrmacht's last hopes of recovery. As the war in Europe reached its final months, the full significance of the proximity fuse came into focus, not through grand declarations or dramatic captures, but through the quiet, undeniable transformation of the battlefield. In a conflict defined by massive armies, armored divisions, and devastating air power, it was a device no larger than a man's thumb that tipped the balance at one of the war's most crucial moments. The Battle of the Bulge, a desperate gamble launched under the cloak of winter, became the stage upon which this technological marvel proved its worth with brutal clarity. To understand the magnitude of its impact, one must consider what the proximity fuse truly represented. It was not simply a more effective artillery component. It was a redefinition of warfare itself. Before its arrival, artillery required spotters, corrections, and careful calculations to achieve accuracy factors that became unreliable in the Ardennes, where fog, snow, and dense forests obscured visibility. The fuse eliminated these constraints. It enabled artillery to function independently of sight, weather, or terrain. It introduced a level of consistency and lethality previously reserved for ideal conditions, turning every barrage into a masterstroke of timing and precision. More importantly, it represented a conceptual shift. The battlefield was no longer controlled solely through manpower and maneuver, but increasingly through intelligence embedded into munitions themselves. This marked the dawn of a new era, one in which computation, however rudimentary, began to merge with explosives. The fuse anticipated technologies that would come decades later: smart bombs, guided missiles, autonomous sensors. In Tees, Sinsay, the forests of the Ardennes witnessed not just the breaking of a German offensive, but the birth of modern precision warfare. As historians sifted through reports, diaries, and after-action summaries, a consistent theme emerged. The proximity fuse did not simply contribute to the Allied victory, it made possible outcomes that would otherwise have been catastrophic. It halted German concentrations before they could form. It saved American strongpoints from overwhelming assaults. It preserved lives by reducing the number of enemy combatants who reached close quarters range. And it accelerated the breakdown of German operational planning at the very moment when their last reserves were committed. In personal accounts from soldiers on both sides, the device's influence becomes even more striking. American infantry, who had braced themselves for annihilation in the early days of the offensive, later wrote that the airbursts felt like a shield-on invisible dome of protection keeping unseen enemies at bay. German troops, in contrast, described the sense of being hunted by an omnipresent force. They feared the sound of shells overhead more than tanks or aircraft. They learned, too late, that there was no cover against a weapon designed to defeat cover itself. Yet the proximity fuse's legacy is not one of destruction alone. It is also a testament to collaboration in a time of global crisis. Scientists from universities, engineers from industry, and officers from the field work together in a rare convergence of intellect and urgency. Their achievement stands as a reminder that innovation, when channeled through cooperation and alter the course of history in ways unimaginable at the time. And in the aftermath of the war, the lessons learned from this collaboration shaped the foundations of peacetime research programs, early electronics industries, and defense technologies that continue to influence the world today. By the time victory was declared in Europe, the proximity fuse had already earned its place among the pivotal inventions of the conflict. It did not receive the dramatic unveiling of the atomic bomb, nor the mythic aura of the Enigma machine. But for the men who survived the Ardennes, its significance was unquestionable. Many wrote that they owed their lives to the strange new shells that burst above the treetop. Others said that without the fuse, the German offensive might have succeeded long enough to prolong the war, costing tens of thousands more lives. In the quiet reflections of those who lived through the winter of 1944-45, the device stands as both a savior and a symbol. Today, the proximity fuse remains a reminder of the fragile line between vulnerability and survival, chaos and control. It is a story of ingenuity forged under pressure, of a battlefield transformed from the ground up and from above. And as we look back on the frozen forests of the Ardennes, on the shattered trees and smoking craters, and the weary men who fought beneath a sky filled with both fear and hope, we understand the truth that emerged from that terrible winter. Sometimes, the smallest spark of innovation is all it takes to change the world.